Mike Henderson had been driving 18-wheelers for 15 years when he encountered something on Nevada's Highway 50 that still haunts him today. Known as America's loneliest road, this desolate stretch of asphalt cuts through some of the most isolated terrain in the continental United States, where cell towers are sparse and the nearest town can be over 100 kilometers away. It was October 2019, around 2:30 a.m., when Mike was hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Denver. The highway was completely empty, not unusual for this route, which sees maybe a dozen vehicles on a good night. His CB radio had been silent for hours, and the only sounds were the steady rumble of his diesel engine and the occasional crackle of static from his radio. That's when he first saw the dog. It appeared in his headlights about 50 meters ahead, standing perfectly still in the center of the right lane. At first, Mike thought it was just a large stray, maybe a German Shepherd or Rottweiler that had wandered onto the highway. He slowed down and honked his horn, expecting the animal to scatter into the darkness, like most wildlife does when confronted by an approaching semi-truck. The dog didn't move. As Mike got closer, he could see it more clearly. It was massive, easily the size of a Great Dane, with jet black fur that seemed to absorb his headlights rather than reflect them. The animal was facing his truck directly, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow-green in the halogen beams. What disturbed Mike most was how perfectly still it stood, like a statue carved from shadow. Mike brought his rig to a complete stop about 10 meters from the creature. He sat there for nearly a minute, engine idling, waiting for the dog to move. It never did. It just stared at him with those luminous eyes, completely motionless, except for what Mike swears was the rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. Finally, Mike decided to edge forward slowly, figuring the dog would eventually get spooked and run off. But as his truck crept closer, something impossible happened. The dog began to grow larger. Not in the way objects naturally appear bigger as you approach them, but actually expanding in size, its silhouette stretching upward and outward until it stood nearly as tall as Mike's cab. That's when Mike hit the gas. His truck lurched forward, diesel engine roaring as he accelerated through where the dog had been standing. He expected to feel the horrible impact, to hear the thud of striking an animal, but there was nothing. When he checked his mirrors, the road behind him was empty. The dog had simply vanished. Mike tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was exhaustion. He'd been driving for 8 hours straight. Maybe it was an optical illusion caused by his headlights hitting a road sign or reflector at a weird angle. He'd heard other truckers talk about highway hypnosis and the strange things you might think you see during long night drives. But 20 minutes later, the dog was back. This time, it appeared on an overpass, about a kilometer ahead, standing on the concrete barrier, like it was posing for a photograph. Even from that distance, Mike could see its yellow-green eyes reflecting his headlights. As he approached the overpass, the dog seemed to be watching his truck with an intelligence that made Mike's skin crawl. When he passed underneath, Mike looked up through his windshield and saw the creature looking down at him. Its massive head tracked his movement as he drove beneath it, and for a split second, Mike could have sworn he saw it grin. Not the way a normal dog pants with its tongue out, but an actual human-like grin that stretched across its muzzle. The third encounter happened just as Mike was beginning to convince himself that stress and caffeine pills were playing tricks on his mind. He was approaching a rest area, one of the few on this stretch of highway, when he saw the dog standing next to one of the picnic tables in the parking area. This time, Mike decided to stop. He pulled his rig into the rest area and parked about 30 meters from where he'd seen the creature. The parking area was illuminated by a single flickering streetlight that cast everything in sickly yellow tones. Mike grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from his cab, his boots crunching on the gravel. The dog was gone, but Mike could smell something in the air, a heavy, musky odor, like wet fur mixed with something metallic. As he walked toward the picnic table where he'd seen it, his flashlight beam caught something that made his blood run cold. Scratched deep into the wooden surface of the table were what looked like claw marks, 5 parallel gouges that went completely through the thick pine planks. The scratches were fresh, with wood shavings still scattered around the table. But these weren't ordinary dog claws. The marks were too deep, too precise, and spaced too far apart. They looked more like they'd been made by human fingers, if human fingers had razor-sharp claws at the tips. Mike quickly returned to his truck and locked the doors, something he'd never felt the need to do in 15 years of trucking. He tried calling dispatch on his CB radio, but got only static. His cell phone showed no signal. He was completely alone on America's loneliest road, with something that defied explanation. The fourth and final encounter happened just as dawn was beginning to break over the Nevada mountains. Mike had been driving nonstop, too afraid to pull over again, when he crested a hill and saw the dog standing in the middle of the highway, about half a kilometer ahead. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were at least a dozen of them, all identical in size and color, arranged in a perfect line across both lanes of the highway. They stood with military precision, their yellow-green eyes creating a constellation of light in Mike's headlights. As his truck approached, they began to move, not running away, but walking in formation to the sides of the road, creating a corridor for him to drive through. Mike had no choice but to continue forward. As he passed between the creatures, he could see them through his side windows, standing at attention like an honor guard. Their eyes followed his truck, and Mike swears he could hear something over the noise of his engine, a low rhythmic sound that might have been growling or chanting or something else entirely. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. Mike's mirrors showed nothing but empty highway stretching behind him. When Mike finally reached the truck stop in Ely, Nevada, 3 hours later, he was shaking so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup. He asked the other drivers if they'd ever seen anything strange on Highway 50, expecting them to laugh at him or suggest he get some sleep. Instead, several of them nodded knowingly. Tom Bradley, a veteran driver who'd been running that route for 25 years, pulled Mike aside and told him about his own encounters with what locals call the black dogs of Highway 50. According to Tom, sightings go back decades, always following the same pattern: massive black dogs with glowing eyes that appear to lone drivers during the darkest hours of the night. The Paiute tribe has stories about them going back centuries, Tom explained. They call them something in their language that translates to shadow guardians. Nobody knows what they are or what they want, but they've been seen by dozens of truckers over the years. Most don't talk about it because they're afraid people will think they're crazy. Mike filed a report with the Nevada Department of Transportation about possible wild animals on the highway, but received only a form letter thanking him for his concern. He's continued driving Highway 50 in the years since, but only during daylight hours. He's never seen the dogs again, but sometimes, when he's driving other routes late at night, he finds himself checking his mirrors more often than he used to. The claw marks at that rest stop are still there, according to other drivers who've stopped to look. The Nevada DOT has replaced the picnic table twice, but the scratches always reappear within a few weeks. Park rangers blame vandals, but no one has ever been caught damaging the tables, and surveillance cameras mysteriously malfunction whenever they're installed in that area. Mike Henderson still drives trucks today, but he's never forgotten what he saw on America's loneliest road. Sometimes, late at night, when he's pulling into an empty truck stop, he catches himself scanning the shadows for yellow-green eyes and hoping he never sees them again. Danny Kowalski thought he'd seen everything during his 12 years hauling freight across the American Midwest. Ice storms that turned highways into skating rinks, tornadoes that could flip a loaded semi like a toy, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own hood ornament. But nothing prepared him for what he encountered on Interstate 80 during a blizzard in February 2021. Danny was driving eastbound from Des Moines to Chicago, carrying a load of agricultural equipment. The weather forecast had been calling for snow, but meteorologists underestimated the storm's intensity. What started as light flurries around 9 p.m. quickly escalated into a full-blown blizzard, with winds gusting over 60 kilometers per hour, and snow falling so heavily that Danny's wipers could barely keep up. By midnight, visibility had dropped to almost zero. Danny was crawling along at 30 kilometers per hour, following the faint red glow of taillights from another truck about 50 meters ahead. His CB radio crackled with reports from other drivers. Several had already pulled over to wait out the storm, while others were pushing forward, hoping to reach truck stops before conditions got worse. That's when Danny noticed something odd about the truck he was following. The taillights seemed wrong somehow. They were too bright, almost luminescent in the swirling snow, and they had an unusual reddish-orange tint that Danny had never seen on any modern truck. The light seemed to pulse rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and it cut through the blizzard with an intensity that defied the conditions. Danny tried raising the driver on his CB radio, cycling through channels 17, 19, and 21, the frequencies most truckers monitored. Breaker 19. This is Freight Dog following the truck with the bright taillights eastbound on I-80. Come back. Nothing but static. He tried again on channel 17. Hey there, big truck ahead of me, you got your ears on? Still nothing. As they continued through the storm, Danny began to notice other trucks joining their convoy. One by one, additional vehicles fell in line behind the lead truck, their headlights creating a chain of light through the darkness. Within an hour, Danny counted at least 15 trucks moving in perfect formation, all following those unnaturally bright taillights. What disturbed Danny most was the precision of their movement. Despite the treacherous conditions, every truck in the convoy maintained exactly the same speed and spacing. There was no wavering, no brake lights flashing as drivers struggled with visibility, no signs of the constant adjustments that driving in a blizzard required. They moved like they were connected by invisible cables, synchronized in a way that seemed impossible given the conditions. Danny tried radioing the other trucks in the convoy, but his calls went unanswered. The CB channels were eerily quiet. No weather reports, no chatter between drivers, not even the usual profanity-laced complaints about road conditions that typically filled the airwaves during storms like this. It was as if he and these other trucks existed in a bubble of silence while the blizzard raged around them. Around 2 a.m., something even stranger happened. Danny realized he should have reached the Iowa-Illinois border over an hour ago, but there were no signs indicating state lines, no mile markers, no exit ramps, nothing but endless highway, stretching into the white void. The landscape on either side of the interstate had become completely featureless, just endless snow-covered plains that seemed to extend beyond the reach of his headlights. Danny checked his GPS, but the screen showed only a blinking cursor with no map data. His odometer was working, showing that he'd traveled over 200 kilometers since joining the convoy. But according to his route, he should have been in downtown Chicago by now. The fuel gauge showed he was running low, which made sense given the distance, but somehow he didn't feel the familiar sluggishness that came with a nearly empty tank. That's when Danny decided to break formation. He slowed down and pulled into what he hoped was the right lane, intending to let the convoy pass and then find somewhere to stop and wait out the storm. But as he reduced speed, something impossible happened. The other trucks slowed down with him. Every single vehicle in the convoy adjusted its speed to match his, maintaining that perfect formation. Danny accelerated. The convoy accelerated. He tapped his brakes. Every truck behind him tapped their brakes in perfect unison, their brake lights flashing like synchronized Christmas displays. No matter what Danny did, the convoy mirrored his movements exactly, as if he had somehow become their pace car. Panic began to set in. Danny grabbed his CB microphone and started broadcasting on every channel. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Freight Dog on I-80 eastbound. I've got a situation here. Anybody copy?" The static was overwhelming now, punctuated by strange sounds that might have been voices or might have been just the storm interfering with the signal. Then Danny saw the exit ramp. It appeared suddenly in his headlights, materializing out of the blizzard like a mirage. There was no exit sign, no indication of where it led, just a ramp curving off into the darkness. Without thinking, Danny yanked his steering wheel to the right and took the exit, desperate to escape whatever was happening on the main highway. As he curved down the ramp, Danny looked in his mirrors and saw the convoy continuing straight on the interstate, those pulsing taillights disappearing into the storm. For the first time in hours, he was alone with just the sound of his engine and the wind howling outside his cab. The exit ramp led to a truck stop that Danny had never seen before, despite driving this route dozens of times over the years. It was an old-style plaza with a single building housing a diner, fuel pumps, and a small parking area. Despite the blizzard, the lot was well lit and the pavement was clear of snow, as if the storm somehow didn't affect this small pocket of highway. Danny pulled up to the fuel pumps and climbed down from his cab. The silence was deafening after hours of wind and engine noise. No snow was falling here, though he could see the blizzard raging just beyond the truck stop's perimeter, like an invisible dome was protecting the area. Inside the diner, Danny found 3 other truck drivers sitting at the counter, all looking as shaken as he felt. When he described his experience with the convoy, their faces went pale. One of them, an older driver named Pete, nodded slowly. "You saw the Phantom convoy," Pete said quietly. "Been happening for years, but only during the worst storms. Drivers get caught up in it and follow those lights for hours, sometimes all night. Most don't talk about it because they think people will say they were hallucinating from sleep deprivation or carbon monoxide." According to Pete, the Phantom convoy always appeared during severe weather conditions on I-80, particularly during blizzards. Drivers would find themselves following a lead truck with unusually bright taillights, joined by other vehicles that moved in perfect synchronization. Those who tried to break away found themselves unable to do so until they spotted an exit that led to safety. "The scary part," Pete continued, "is checking your logbook afterward. Time doesn't add up right. You'll think you've been driving for hours, but your logbook shows you've only been on the road for 20 minutes. Or the opposite. You think you've been following those lights for half an hour, but you've actually lost 3 hours somehow." Danny checked his own logbook and electronic logging device. According to his records, he'd been driving for only 45 minutes since leaving Des Moines, despite spending what felt like hours in that convoy. His fuel gauge, which had been nearly empty when he took the exit, now showed 3/4 full. The diner's waitress, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Martha, brought Danny coffee without being asked. "You're not the first driver to stumble in here looking like you've seen a ghost," she said. "This truck stop has been here since 1952, and we've been helping drivers who encounter the convoy for just as long. My grandfather built this place specifically for that purpose. Martha explained that her family had been aware of the phenomenon for decades. Her grandfather had been a truck driver himself in the 1940s and had his own encounter with mysterious lights during a blizzard. When he opened the truck stop, he positioned it at what he called a breakpoint in the phenomenon, a place where drivers could escape the convoy's influence. "We don't advertise, don't show up on GPS, and most drivers can't find us unless they really need to," Martha said. "But we're always here when someone needs help getting away from those lights." Danny spent the rest of the night at the truck stop, sleeping in his cab and talking with other drivers who'd had similar experiences. In the morning, the blizzard had passed, and I-80 was clear and normal. Danny found the on-ramp easily and continued his journey to Chicago, arriving only an hour behind schedule despite the night's events. When he tried to find the truck stop again on his return trip, it wasn't there. The exit ramp he'd taken was gone, and there was no trace that it had ever existed. Danny's GPS showed no record of any truck stops in that area, and when he asked other drivers about it, they just shrugged and changed the subject. 6 months later, Danny encountered the Phantom convoy again during a thunderstorm on the same stretch of I-80. This time, he knew what to look for and managed to spot the exit ramp earlier. Martha was still there, still pouring coffee for shaken drivers who'd managed to escape the mysterious lights. "Some drivers see them once and never again," she told him. "Others, like you, seem to be sensitive to whatever's causing this. Consider yourself lucky. You found the way out. Not everyone does." Danny still drives I-80 regularly, but he's learned to read the signs. When the weather turns severe and the radio goes quiet, when the landscape becomes too uniform and time seems to stretch or compress, he starts looking for that exit ramp. He's helped 3 other drivers escape the convoy over the years, teaching them to watch for the telltale signs and never to trust those pulsing red lights that seem too bright for the conditions. The Phantom convoy still appears during major storms, and drivers still report following mysterious taillights through impossible conditions. Most assume it's fatigue or weather-related hallucinations, but a few know better. They know to look for the exit that isn't on any map, the truck stop that doesn't exist except when you need it most, and the waitress who's been pouring coffee for lost drivers for over 70 years. Carl Martinez had been driving the overnight route between Dallas and Fort Worth for 8 years when he first heard the broadcast that would change everything. It was a Tuesday night in March 2020, around 1:15 a.m., and Carl was hauling a load of construction materials down Route 287. The highway was nearly empty except for the occasional pair of headlights heading in the opposite direction. Carl's CB radio had been acting up for weeks, picking up strange interference and distant conversations that seemed to fade in and out like ghost signals. His dispatcher had been after him to get it fixed, but Carl kept putting it off. He figured it was just atmospheric conditions, or maybe interference from the cell towers that dotted the highway. That night, as Carl was passing through the small town of Mansfield, his radio crackled to life with unusual clarity. Instead of the typical trucker chatter, he heard what sounded like an old-fashioned radio show, the kind his grandfather used to listen to in the 1940s, complete with dramatic music and an announcer with that distinctive mid-century broadcasting voice. "Good evening, night travelers," the voice said smoothly. "You're listening to KNTM, broadcasting live from the crossroads of nowhere and everywhere. I'm your host, bringing you the stories that travel our highways after dark." Carl had never heard of KNTM, and the call letters didn't match any station he knew in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He tried adjusting his tuner, but the signal remained strong and clear on Channel 19, the frequency truckers used for road communication, not radio shows. The program continued with what the host called Traveler's Tales, supposedly true stories submitted by drivers about strange encounters on the road. The first story was about a trucker who kept seeing the same hitchhiker at different locations, hundreds of kilometers apart, always standing under broken streetlights with his thumb out. The second was about a driver who took a wrong turn and ended up on a highway that wasn't on any map, leading to a town that had been abandoned for 50 years. Carl found himself captivated, despite the oddness of hearing a radio drama on his CB frequency. The host's voice was hypnotic, and the stories were told with such detail and conviction that they felt uncomfortably real. As each tale concluded, the host would say, "Remember, night travelers, the highway keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares them with those who listen." Around 2:30 a.m., the show took a commercial break, but instead of advertisements, Carl heard what sounded like emergency broadcasts from decades past. Air raid warnings from World War II, emergency weather alerts for hurricanes that had hit Texas in the 1960s, and tornado warnings for storms that had already passed. The dates mentioned in these broadcasts were all wrong, referencing years that had already happened as if they were current events. When the show returned, the host's tone had changed. His voice was more urgent, more personal. "Tonight we have a special caller," he announced. "A driver traveling Route 287 who's been listening to our broadcast. Carl from Dallas. Are you still with us?" Carl's blood went cold. He hadn't called in to any radio show. He grabbed his CB microphone and keyed up. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" "We know all our regular listeners, Carl," the host replied through the radio's speaker. "You've been hearing our signal for weeks now, haven't you? Those conversations that fade in and out, those voices you can't quite understand. We've been trying to reach you." Carl's hands were shaking as he held the microphone. "This is impossible. You're broadcasting on CB Channel 19. This frequency is for truckers, not radio shows." The host chuckled, a sound that seemed to echo through Carl's cab, even after the transmission ended. "Time works differently on the night highways, Carl. Signals from the past, the present, and places that might never exist all travel the same roads. You've been chosen to hear our broadcast because you're sensitive to these frequencies." "Chosen for what?" Carl demanded. "To share your story, of course. Every listener eventually becomes part of our program. Tell us, Carl, what's the strangest thing you've encountered during your 8 years of night driving?" Carl wanted to hang up, to turn off his radio, but something compelled him to respond. He found himself telling the host about a night 2 years ago when he'd seen every overpass light flicker in perfect sequence as he drove beneath them, creating a pattern that seemed to follow his truck for over 50 kilometers. He described another incident where his GPS had guided him to a truck stop that wasn't there when he arrived, leaving him stranded on an empty road with no memory of how he'd gotten lost. As Carl spoke, he realized he was sharing experiences he'd never told anyone. Events he'd convinced himself were hallucinations, brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But saying them out loud made them feel real again, and more disturbing than he'd originally thought. "Excellent, Carl," the host said when he finished. "Those are exactly the kind of encounters our listeners want to hear about. You'll make a wonderful addition to our regular programming." "What do you mean, regular programming?" Carl asked. But the host had moved on to introduce the next story, a tale about a driver who kept receiving CB calls from his deceased partner, warning him about road hazards that hadn't happened yet. Carl tried changing channels, but KNTM was broadcasting on every frequency now. No matter where he tuned his radio, he heard the same voice, the same eerie stories, the same hypnotic cadence that seemed to pull him deeper into the broadcast. His truck's digital clock showed 3:45 a.m., but according to the radio show, it was midnight and would remain midnight until the program ended. That's when Carl noticed the other trucks. 3 semis had fallen in behind him, maintaining perfect spacing and speed. In his mirrors, Carl could see that each cab was dimly lit by the same greenish glow that emanated from old radio dials. The drivers appeared to be leaning forward, as if listening intently to something. Carl tried radioing the other trucks, but got no response. Instead, the KNTM host's voice came through his speaker. "Our traveling audience is growing, Carl. Your fellow drivers have been listening to tonight's broadcast as well. They're all part of our community now." "What community?" Carl shouted into his microphone. "What do you want from us?" "We want your stories, Carl. The highway collects experiences, and we preserve them. Every strange encounter, every unexplained sighting, every moment when the normal rules don't apply, these become part of our archive. And in return, you become part of something larger than yourself." The radio show continued, but now Carl recognized some of the voices telling stories. One was Jimmy Patterson, a driver who disappeared 3 months ago on this same route. Another was Sandra Williams, who'd vanished from I-35 the previous year. Their voices were clear and enthusiastic as they shared their tales of highway strangeness, as if they were calling in from comfortable studios rather than wherever they actually were. Carl's fuel gauge was reading empty, which was impossible since he'd filled up in Dallas. His odometer showed he'd traveled over 400 kilometers, but Route 287 between Dallas and Fort Worth was only about 60 kilometers long. The landscape outside his windows had become unfamiliar, rolling hills dotted with radio towers that pulsed with the same rhythm as the host's voice. "Don't fight it, Carl," the host said, his voice now coming from multiple speakers throughout the cab. "Every night driver eventually joins our broadcast. The highway has been calling to you for years, and now you're finally ready to answer." Carl saw an exit ramp ahead, exit 371, according to the sign, though he knew no such exit existed on Route 287. As he approached, he had a choice: continue following the other trucks deeper into whatever this broadcast represented, or take the unknown exit and hope it led back to reality. He yanked the wheel to the right and took the exit, his tires squealing as he fought to control the heavy truck. In his mirrors, he watched the convoy of 3 trucks continue straight, their taillights fading into the distance as the KNTM signal dissolved into static. The exit led to a 24-hour truck stop that Carl recognized, a normal, brightly lit plaza where he'd stopped dozens of times before. His fuel gauge read 3/4 full, his odometer showed the correct mileage, and his radio was picking up normal CB chatter from other drivers complaining about construction delays and speed traps. Carl sat in his cab for 20 minutes, trying to process what had happened. When he finally keyed up his radio to call dispatch, his hands were still shaking. He reported his location and estimated arrival time, keeping his voice steady and professional. But that wasn't the end of Carl's encounters with KNTM. Every few months, usually during the darkest part of the night, his radio would pick up fragments of the broadcast. He'd hear the host's voice welcoming new listeners, or catch snippets of stories from drivers who'd recently vanished from various highways across Texas. The signal was always strongest on Route 287, and Carl learned to recognize the signs, the way shadows seemed deeper, how mile markers became hard to read, the subtle change in his engine's sound that meant he was being drawn into the broadcast's influence. Carl started carrying a small notebook, documenting each encounter with KNTM. Over 2 years, he recorded 37 partial broadcasts, noting the dates, times, and locations where the signal was strongest. He discovered that the phenomenon wasn't limited to Route 287. Other drivers had reported similar experiences on highways throughout the Southwest, always involving radio broadcasts that shouldn't exist, and convoys of trucks that disappeared when investigated. The most disturbing entry in Carl's notebook was from October 2022, when he clearly heard his own voice on the KNTM broadcast, telling a story about a phantom radio show that lured drivers into joining its eternal program. He was describing his first encounter with the host, using the exact words he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. "The highway keeps its secrets," his recorded voice said through the radio's speaker, "but sometimes it shares them with those who listen." Carl still drives Route 287, but he's learned to read the warning signs. When his radio starts picking up old emergency broadcasts, when the mile markers begin to blur, when other trucks appear behind him with those telltale green glowing cabs, he looks for the nearest exit and takes it, no matter where it leads. He's helped 4 other drivers escape the KNTM broadcast by sharing his notebook and teaching them to recognize the symptoms. But Carl knows that someday there might not be an exit ramp when he needs one. The host's voice grows more insistent each time, more personal, more familiar. And sometimes, late at night when he's alone on the highway, Carl finds himself wondering what it would be like to stop fighting and finally join the community of drivers who never have to worry about fuel, schedules, or the loneliness of the road. Drivers who have all the time in the world to share their stories with fellow travelers who understand the strange magnetism of America's highways after midnight. Frank Rodriguez had been hauling freight between Phoenix and Albuquerque for 6 years when he first noticed the reflections that didn't belong to him. It started small, just glimpses in his side mirrors that seemed slightly off, movements that didn't quite match his own actions. Frank initially blamed it on fatigue and the desert heat mirages that were common along Interstate 40 through Arizona and New Mexico. The route Frank drove 3 times a week took him through some of the most desolate terrain in the American Southwest. Mile 237, where his problems began, sat in the middle of a particularly barren stretch between Gallup, New Mexico, and the Arizona border. The area was notorious among truckers for its complete lack of services. No truck stops, no rest areas, just endless scrubland dotted with the occasional abandoned building from the region's mining days. It was during a night run in September 2021 when Frank first saw him clearly, another version of himself in the passenger side mirror. But this reflection was doing things Frank wasn't doing. While Frank kept both hands on the steering wheel, his mirror image was gesturing with his right hand, pointing at something outside the passenger window. When Frank turned to look, there was nothing but darkness and desert. Frank pulled over at the next truck stop in Gallup and spent 20 minutes examining his mirrors for cracks, distortions, or anything that might explain what he'd seen. The mirrors were perfect. Not even a chip or scratch that could create optical illusions. He cleaned them thoroughly and continued his run, convincing himself it had been a trick of the dashboard lights reflecting at weird angles. But 3 days later, on his next westbound trip, it happened again at exactly mile 237. This time, Frank was prepared. He had positioned his phone to record his mirrors while driving through that section of highway. What he captured on video still makes his hands shake when he watches it. In the recording, Frank can be seen driving normally, both hands on the wheel, occasionally reaching for his coffee cup. But in the mirrors, both the driver's side and passenger side, his reflections are behaving completely independently. The mirror version of Frank on the driver's side appears to be talking animatedly to someone, his mouth moving in conversation, though Frank himself remained silent. The passenger side reflection showed Frank looking terrified, constantly checking over his shoulder and gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white with tension. Most disturbing of all, both reflections occasionally looked directly at the real Frank, making eye contact through the mirrors with expressions of desperate pleading. as if they were trying to warn him about something. Frank showed the video to his wife Maria, expecting her to provide a rational explanation, or at least reassure him that he was seeing things. Instead, she went pale and made him promise to avoid that stretch of highway. When Frank pressed her for an explanation, Maria reluctantly told him about her own experience on that route. 2 years earlier, Maria had accompanied Frank on a run to Phoenix. While Frank was sleeping in the cab during his mandatory rest period, Maria had been keeping watch in the passenger seat. Around 3 a.m., as they were parked at a rest area near mile 237, she saw Frank in the truck's mirrors, climbing down from the cab and walking toward the desert, even though he was clearly asleep beside her. "I watched your reflection walk into the darkness," Maria told him. "It moved just like you do, had your same mannerisms, but you were right there snoring. When I woke you up to tell you about it, you thought I was having a nightmare. But Frank, I was wide awake. That thing in the mirror looked exactly like you, but it wasn't you." Frank started researching the area around mile 237 and discovered a pattern of reports dating back decades. The New Mexico Department of Transportation had received dozens of complaints from drivers about mirror malfunctions in that specific area. Most reports were dismissed as driver fatigue or equipment problems, but the consistency of the location raised questions among some state officials. Local Navajo communities had their own explanations for the phenomenon. According to tribal elder Joseph Yazzie, whom Frank contacted through a cultural center in Gallup, the area around mile 237 was considered dangerous long before the interstate was built. In our language, we call it the place where shadows separate, Yazzie explained during a phone conversation with Frank. Our people avoided that area because reflections and shadows don't behave properly there. Your ancestor spirits can become confused about which world they belong to, the real world or the mirror world. Yazzie told Frank that the problem had worsened since the interstate was constructed in the 1960s. The constant stream of vehicles with mirrors and reflective surfaces had created what he described as a pathway between worlds that allowed mirror images to develop their own consciousness and purpose. The reflections are trying to warn the real people about something, Yazzie said, but they're trapped in the mirror world and can only communicate through gestures and expressions. Most drivers don't understand what they're seeing, so they ignore the warnings. Frank's encounters became more frequent and more intense. On his next several trips through mile 237, his mirror reflections became increasingly agitated. They would point frantically at specific locations along the highway, cover their faces with their hands as if terrified, or make stopping gestures as if trying to prevent Frank from continuing forward. The breaking point came in November 2021. Frank was making his usual Phoenix run when, just before reaching mile 237, his mirrors went completely black. Not broken or cracked, just solid black, as if they were showing deep water or empty space instead of reflections. Frank could see the truck behind him in his mirrors and the landscape to his sides, but no reflection of himself or his cab interior. That's when Frank heard the CB radio crackle to life with his own voice. "Frank, can you hear me? This is Frank Rodriguez driving eastbound on I-40. I'm trapped in the mirrors and I need you to listen carefully." Frank grabbed his microphone with trembling hands. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" "I am you," the voice replied. "I'm your reflection from 3 months ago. The first time you saw me at mile 237, I got separated from you somehow. I've been trying to warn you ever since." The voice on the radio explained that Frank's reflection had become stuck between the mirror world and reality, able to observe events that hadn't happened yet to the real Frank. For months, This mirror version had been watching a future where Frank's truck would be involved in a serious accident at mile 238, just 1 mile ahead of the phenomenon zone. "There's going to be a tire blowout on your trailer in about 2 minutes," the mirror Frank warned. "You'll lose control and jackknife across both lanes. I've watched it happen 7 times now, trying to figure out how to prevent it." Frank immediately pulled over to the shoulder and climbed out to inspect his trailer. The rear tire on the driver's side was nearly bald, with steel belting showing through the rubber. In normal circumstances, it might have lasted another few hundred kilometers, but not on the rough pavement and steep grades coming up ahead. Frank called for road service and had the tire replaced, a delay that probably saved his life. When he resumed driving and passed mile 238, he saw the remnants of a recent accident: skid marks, debris, and emergency vehicles cleaning up what looked like exactly the kind of jackknife scenario his mirror reflection had described. The CB radio crackled one more time as Frank passed mile 237 heading east. "Thank you for listening," his own voice said. "I can rest now." Frank's mirrors returned to normal after that, showing only his regular reflection. But he learned from other drivers that the phenomenon continued for others. Jimmy Torres, who drove the same route twice a week, reported seeing multiple versions of himself in his mirrors, all apparently from different time periods, based on their clothing and the condition of the truck cab they were driving. Sarah Chen, one of the few female drivers who regularly traveled that route, described seeing her reflection signing frantically in what she recognized as American Sign Language, even though Sarah herself was not deaf and didn't know ASL. When she had the gestures translated, they spelled out warnings about upcoming construction zones and weather hazards that proved to be accurate. Frank started keeping a logbook of reports from drivers who'd experienced mirror anomalies around mile 237. Over 2 years, he documented 43 separate incidents, ranging from simple behavioral differences in reflections to complex communication attempts. The most common theme was that the mirror reflections seemed to be trying to prevent accidents or warn about hazards. The New Mexico Department of Transportation eventually acknowledged the pattern of reports and commissioned a study of the mile 237 area. Geologists found unusual mineral deposits that could potentially affect electromagnetic fields, while atmospheric scientists noted temperature inversions that occurred frequently in that specific location due to the desert topography. But no scientific explanation could account for the specificity of the warnings or the apparent consciousness of the reflections. The official report concluded that while environmental factors might contribute to optical illusions, the consistency of experiences suggested an unexplained phenomenon worthy of continued observation. Frank still drives the Phoenix-Albuquerque route, but he's developed a ritual for passing mile 237. He always checks his mirrors carefully before entering that stretch of highway, and if he sees any unusual behavior from his reflection, he pulls over immediately and inspects his truck thoroughly. The mirror warnings have helped him avoid 3 more potential accidents, including a brake failure that his reflection detected by frantically pumping an imaginary brake pedal. Other drivers have started adopting Frank's approach, treating their mirror reflections around mile 237 as an early warning system rather than a source of fear. An informal network has developed among regular drivers on that route, sharing information about what their reflections have shown them and comparing notes on the accuracy of the warnings. Frank keeps a photograph of the mile 237 marker on his dashboard as a reminder to pay attention when he reaches that spot. Sometimes, when he looks at the photo, he swears he can see a faint reflection of himself waving from somewhere inside the image, as if all the mirror versions of drivers who've passed through that area have found a way to stay connected to the real world, continuing their efforts to protect their flesh and blood counterparts from the dangers that only they can see coming. Bobby Chen had been driving the same route between Portland and Seattle for 4 years when he discovered the rest stop that shouldn't exist. Located exactly 17 kilometers south of Olympia on Interstate 5, the facility appeared overnight in January 2022, complete with fuel pumps, a convenience store, and parking for 40 trucks. What made it impossible was that Bobby had driven past that exact spot the day before, and there had been nothing but forest. Bobby first noticed the rest stop during his regular Tuesday morning southbound run. He was running low on fuel and getting tired after driving through the night, so the sight of a well-lit truck plaza was a welcome relief. The sign read, "Cascade View Travel Plaza, 24-hour service," in clean, modern lettering, and the facility looked brand new, with fresh asphalt and bright LED lighting. As Bobby pulled into the fuel island, he felt something was off. The attendant who came out to help him was wearing a uniform that looked like it belonged in the 1970s, a brown polyester shirt with an orange vest and a name tag that simply read, Earl. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with perfectly groomed gray hair and an unnaturally bright smile. "Fill her up?" Earl asked, his voice carrying a slight echo, as if he were speaking in an empty room rather than outdoors. "Yeah, diesel," Bobby replied, climbing down from his cab. "This place is new, right? I drive this route twice a week and I've never seen it before." Earl's smile never wavered. "We've been here as long as we need to have been here. Time works differently at truck stops, you know. Some folks find us right when they need us most." Bobby tried to process this cryptic response while Earl filled his tank. The fuel pumps were old-fashioned analog models with spinning numbers, the kind that had been phased out decades ago. Yet the diesel flowed smoothly, and the price per gallon was suspiciously low, nearly 50 cents cheaper than anywhere else on I-5. Inside the convenience store, Bobby found shelves stocked with products he hadn't seen in years. There were candy bars with packaging from the 1980s, soda brands that had been discontinued, and magazines with cover dates that didn't make sense. A copy of Truckers Monthly was dated March 1995, but the headlines referenced current events and truck models that had only been released recently. The cashier was a woman in her 50s, wearing a beehive hairstyle and cat-eye glasses that screamed 1960s. Her name tag read Dolores, and she handled the vintage cash register with practiced efficiency. When Bobby paid for his fuel and a cup of coffee, she gave him change in coins that looked freshly minted but bore dates from the 1970s and 1980s. "You seem confused, honey," Dolores said, her voice carrying the same slight echo as Earl's. "First time at Cascade View?" "Yeah, I guess so. When did this place open?" Dolores exchanged a meaningful look with Earl, who had followed Bobby inside. "We opened when the highway needed us," she said. "Some truck stops serve the road. We serve the drivers who need a different kind of rest." Bobby left the rest stop feeling unsettled, but couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The facility had been clean, well-staffed, and convenient. The fuel was cheap, and his truck ran fine. Yet something about the encounter nagged at him for the rest of his drive to Portland. 2 days later, on his return trip to Seattle, Bobby looked for the rest stop again. He knew exactly where it should be, 17 kilometers south of Olympia, right after the exit for Highway 101. But when he reached that spot, there was nothing but the same dense forest of Douglas fir trees that had always been there. Bobby pulled over at the next exit and called the Washington State Department of Transportation. After being transferred 3 times, he finally reached someone who could access records of commercial developments along I-5. "I'm not showing any new truck stops or travel plazas in that area," the official told him. The last commercial development near Olympia was approved in 2018, and that was just a gas station. "Are you sure about the location?" Bobby was certain. He drove the same route twice a week and knew every landmark, every exit, every curve in the road. The Cascade View Travel Plaza had been there Tuesday morning, but by Thursday afternoon it was gone. Over the following weeks, Bobby started asking other drivers about the mysterious rest stop. Most just shrugged or suggested he'd been more tired than he'd realized. But 3 drivers, all regulars on the Portland-Seattle route, had their own stories about Cascade View. Tommy Williams, a veteran driver with 25 years on the road, claimed he'd stopped there in December 2021. He described the same retro atmosphere, the same eerily helpful staff, and fuel prices that were impossibly low. Like Bobby, Tommy couldn't find the rest stop when he looked for it on subsequent trips. "I figured I'd dreamed the whole thing," Tommy said during a conversation at a truck stop in Centralia. "But I still have the receipt from Dolores. Look at this." Tommy showed Bobby a fuel receipt printed on paper that looked decades old, with faded ink and a carbon copy backing. The header read, "Cascade View Travel Plaza," with an address that didn't exist, and a phone number that, when Bobby called it, produced only a recording. "You have reached a number that is no longer in service, or has never been in service." The third driver, Maria Santos, had an even stranger experience. She'd stopped at Cascade View during a blizzard in February 2022, when visibility was near zero, and she desperately needed a safe place to wait out the storm. The rest stop had appeared like a beacon in the whiteout conditions, fully operational despite the severe weather. "The weird thing was," Maria explained, "there was no snow in the parking lot, not a flake. The storm was raging all around the rest stop, but it was like there was a dome of clear weather protecting the place. Earl told me storms couldn't touch Cascade View because it existed in a pocket of stability between destinations." Maria had spent 4 hours at the rest stop, sleeping in her cab while the blizzard raged outside. When she woke up, the storm had passed, and she found herself parked on the shoulder of I-5 with no rest stop in sight. Her fuel gauge showed she'd filled up somewhere, and she had a receipt from Dolores, but the location where she'd stopped was just empty forest. Bobby became obsessed with finding Cascade View again. He started varying his schedule, driving the Portland-Seattle route at different times of day and night. He researched the history of that section of I-5, looking for any mention of previous truck stops or commercial developments. What he found was disturbing. County records showed that a truck stop called Cascade View Travel Plaza had indeed existed in that location, but it had been demolished in 1987 after a series of accidents and unexplained incidents. The original facility had been built in 1974 and had served drivers for 13 years before being permanently closed. According to newspaper archives Bobby found at the Olympia Public Library, the original Cascade View had gained a reputation among truckers as a place where strange things happened. Drivers reported losing time there, finding vintage products that shouldn't have been in stock, and interacting with staff members who seemed disconnected from reality. The final incident that led to the truck stop's closure involved a driver named Robert Martinez, who disappeared after stopping at Cascade View in November 1987. His truck was found parked at the rest stop 3 days later, engine still running, but Martinez was gone. He was never found, and his disappearance prompted a state investigation that revealed numerous irregularities in the facility's operation. Most disturbing was the discovery that the truck stop's employee records listed staff members who had died years earlier. Earl Thompson had worked at Cascade View from 1974 until his death in a car accident in 1981. Dolores Peterson had been employed there from 1975 until her death from cancer in 1983. Yet both were listed as active employees on the payroll right up until the facility closed. Bobby realized he'd been interacting with people who had been dead for decades. The knowledge didn't stop Bobby from looking for Cascade View, though. Something about the place drew him back, despite the unsettling implications. He began to understand that the rest stop appeared only when drivers truly needed it, not just for fuel or food, but for something deeper. In March 2022, Bobby found Cascade View again during one of the worst nights of his career. He'd been dealing with a family crisis, hadn't slept properly in 3 days, and was pushing himself far beyond safe driving limits. As he struggled to stay awake on the dark highway, fighting microsleep episodes that could have killed him and other drivers, the familiar lights of the rest stop appeared in his headlights. Earl greeted him at the fuel pumps with the same timeless smile. "You look like you need more than just diesel tonight, Bobby." Inside the convenience store, Dolores had a cot set up in a back room. "Rest stops aren't just for trucks," she said gently. "Sometimes drivers need to rest their souls, too. You've been carrying too much weight lately, and not the kind you haul in your trailer." Bobby slept for 6 hours in that back room, the deepest and most peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. When he woke up, he felt genuinely refreshed for the first time in months. Earl and Dolores were waiting with fresh coffee and sandwiches that tasted like his grandmother's cooking. "The highway takes care of its own," Earl explained as Bobby prepared to leave. "But sometimes we need help taking care of ourselves. That's what Cascade View is really for." Bobby tried to pay for the room, the food, and the fuel, but Dolores waved away his money. "You've already paid," she said, "by being someone who needed us to be here." As Bobby drove away, he looked in his mirrors and watched the rest stop fade into the forest, its lights dimming until there was nothing but darkness and trees. He understood now that Cascade View existed in the spaces between normal reality, appearing when the highway's demands became too much for a driver to handle alone. Bobby still drives the Portland-Seattle route, and he still looks for Cascade View during his most difficult trips. He's found it 3 more times over the past 2 years, always when he's needed it most. Once during a severe bout of depression following his father's death, once when mechanical problems had stranded him far from help, and once during a crisis of confidence that had him considering quitting trucking altogether. Each time, Earl and Dolores have been there with exactly what he needed: a safe place to rest, practical help with his truck, or just someone to listen without judgment. Bobby has learned to recognize the signs that Cascade View is about to appear: a subtle shift in the quality of light, a sense of anticipation in the air, and the feeling that the highway itself is reaching out to offer comfort. Other drivers on the route have started coming to Bobby with their own Cascade View experiences. There's an informal network now of truckers who've found the impossible rest stop, sharing their stories and looking out for colleagues who might need to discover it for themselves. They don't advertise or post about it online. They've learned that Cascade View can only be found by those who truly need it, and only when the highway decides they're ready for the kind of rest that goes deeper than sleep. Jake Morrison had been hauling cargo across the Midwest for 9 years when he first encountered the headlights that wouldn't go away. It started on a foggy November night in 2020, somewhere between Des Moines and Omaha on Interstate 80. Jake was running behind schedule, pushing through weather that should have grounded him hours earlier, when he noticed a pair of headlights in his mirrors that seemed to match his every move with unnatural precision. At first, Jake assumed it was just another trucker following his lead through the thick fog. Visibility was down to maybe 30 meters, and it made sense for drivers to convoy together for safety. Jake had done it himself plenty of times. Find a truck with good lights and follow at a safe distance until conditions improved. But these headlights were different. They maintained exactly the same distance behind Jake's trailer, regardless of his speed. When Jake slowed down for a curve, the lights slowed down. When he accelerated on straightaways, they accelerated. When he changed lanes to pass a slower vehicle, the headlights changed lanes too, staying precisely 40 meters behind him, like they were connected by an invisible tether. Jake tried radioing the driver behind him on Channel 19. "Breaker 19, this is Freight Runner to the truck following me eastbound on I-80. You got your ears on?" Nothing but static. He tried channels 17 and 21 with the same result. Either the driver wasn't monitoring CB radio, or something was interfering with the signal. The fog began to lift around midnight, and Jake expected to finally get a good look at the truck that had been shadowing him for over 2 hours. But as visibility improved, what he saw made no sense. The headlights were there, 2 perfectly round beams cutting through the darkness, but there was no truck attached to them. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked again. The headlights hung in the air behind his trailer, like they were mounted on an invisible vehicle. They moved with fluid precision, banking around curves and adjusting height as they followed the contours of the highway, but there was absolutely nothing visible supporting them. Jake pulled over at the next rest area, his hands shaking as he brought his rig to a stop. The headlights pulled over behind him, maintaining their 40-meter distance. They sat there in the parking lot, 2 beams of light pointing directly at Jake's trailer, unblinking and unwavering. Jake grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from his cab, determined to solve the mystery. As he walked toward the lights, they began to back away, maintaining the same distance. When Jake stopped, they stopped. When he advanced, they retreated. It was like a bizarre game of tag with something that might not even exist. "What do you want?" Jake shouted into the darkness, feeling foolish but desperate for answers. The headlights pulsed once, a quick dimming and brightening that might have been acknowledgement or might have been coincidence. Then they began to move in a pattern, sweeping back and forth like they were searching for something, before settling back into their stationary position. Jake returned to his truck and called his dispatcher, but the conversation didn't go well. "How do you explain that you're being followed by disembodied headlights?" Jake ended up reporting mechanical issues and took his mandatory rest break early, hoping the lights would disappear while he slept. They didn't. When Jake woke up 6 hours later, the headlights were still there, patient and unmoving in his mirrors. As soon as he started his engine and pulled back onto I-80, they resumed their perfect pursuit, staying exactly 40 meters behind, through Nebraska and into Iowa. Over the following weeks, Jake's mysterious escorts became a regular feature of his long-distance runs. They only appeared during night drives, always in rural areas with minimal traffic, and always maintained that same precise following distance. Jake started documenting their behavior, keeping a detailed log of when and where the lights appeared. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The headlights seemed to know Jake's route better than he did. They would appear just before dangerous sections of highway, areas where accidents were common, where weather conditions turned treacherous, or where construction created hazardous driving conditions. It was as if they were trying to escort him safely through problem areas. Jake's first real clue about their purpose came during a run through Colorado in December 2020. He was hauling electronics from Denver to Kansas City when a sudden blizzard struck the eastern plains. Visibility dropped to 0 within minutes, and Jake found himself completely disoriented on a highway he'd driven hundreds of times. That's when the headlights appeared, but this time, they didn't stay behind him. They pulled alongside his cab, matching his speed perfectly, and began to guide him through the whiteout. When Jake needed to change lanes, the lights moved first, showing him the safe path. When he approached curves he couldn't see, the lights banked ahead of him, indicating the road's direction. For 3 hours, those phantom headlights served as Jake's eyes in the storm, guiding him safely through some of the worst driving conditions of his career. When the blizzard finally cleared near the Kansas border, the lights resumed their usual position 40 meters behind his trailer. Jake started researching the phenomenon and discovered he wasn't alone. Online trucking forums contained scattered reports of similar experiences dating back decades. Drivers described encounters with ghost lights, phantom escorts, and guardian beams that appeared during dangerous conditions to guide trucks to safety. One post particularly caught Jake's attention. A retired driver named Walter Kim described an encounter from 1995 on the same stretch of I-80 where Jake first saw the lights. Walter had been caught in a severe ice storm and was struggling to maintain control of his rig when a pair of headlights appeared to guide him to safety. They knew where every patch of black ice was, Walter wrote, led me around 3 jackknifed trucks and guided me to a truck stop I didn't even know existed. Saved my life, no question about it. Never saw them again after that night, but I still look for them every time I drive that route. Jake contacted Walter through the forum's private messaging system. During their phone conversation, Walter shared details that perfectly matched Jake's experiences. The 40-meter following distance, the precise movements, the way the lights seemed to anticipate road hazards before they became visible. The old-timers used to talk about them back in the 70s and 80s, Walter explained. Called them highway angels or road spirits. The theory was that they were the lights from trucks that had been in fatal accidents, still trying to help other drivers avoid the same fate. Walter directed Jake to archives of trucking magazines from the 1970s and 1980s, where he found dozens of similar accounts. The stories followed consistent patterns. Drivers in distress would be guided to safety by mysterious headlights that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Most reports came from the same corridors that Jake regularly traveled: I-80 through Iowa and Nebraska, I-70 through Kansas and Colorado, and I-35 through the heart of Tornado Alley. Jake's understanding of his phantom escorts deepened during a run in February 2021. He was hauling machinery from Chicago to Denver when his truck began experiencing brake problems in the middle of Kansas. The brakes weren't failing completely, but they were spongy and unreliable, dangerous enough that Jake should have stopped immediately for repairs. The headlights appeared as soon as Jake realized he had a problem, but their behavior was different this time. Instead of following behind, they moved to his left side and began flashing in a specific pattern. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 flashes, pause, 1 flash. They repeated this sequence over and over, while gradually guiding Jake toward an exit he hadn't noticed. The exit led to a small truck repair shop that Jake had never seen before, despite driving this route regularly. The mechanic, an elderly man named Ray, seemed to be expecting him. "Saw your lights coming down the highway," Ray said as he examined Jake's brake system. "Figured you might need some help. These brake lines are about ready to let go completely. You're lucky you stopped when you did." While Ray worked on the truck, Jake mentioned the unusual light pattern that had guided him to the shop. Ray nodded knowingly. 321. That's the old highway emergency code, Ray explained. Truckers used it back before CB radios were common. 3 flashes meant mechanical trouble, 2 meant medical emergency, 1 meant request for help. Your guardian lights were telling you they knew about your brake problem. Ray had been working on trucks at that location for 45 years and had heard dozens of stories about phantom headlights guiding drivers to his shop. This place sits at what you might call A crossroads of the spirit world, he said. Lots of accidents on these highways over the years. Some folks think the lights are the souls of drivers who died trying to help others, still doing their job from the other side. Jake's encounters with the headlights continued for 2 more years, but their appearances became less frequent. As Jake gained experience recognizing dangerous conditions and avoiding hazardous situations, the lights seemed to visit him less often. It was as if they sensed he was becoming capable of protecting himself. The final encounter came in March 2023, during what Jake now recognizes was a test. He was driving through a severe thunderstorm in Oklahoma when he came upon a jackknifed truck blocking both lanes of I-35. The accident was fresh, so recent that emergency responders hadn't arrived yet, and the driver was trapped in his cab. Jake's phantom headlights appeared immediately, but instead of guiding him around the accident, they positioned themselves to illuminate the crash scene. Working in the beam of those mysterious lights, Jake was able to extract the injured driver and provide first aid until paramedics arrived. As the ambulance drove away with the rescued driver, Jake turned to thank his illuminated assistants, but the headlights were fading. For the first time in over 2 years, they dimmed slowly until they disappeared completely, like someone was gradually turning down a rheostat. Jake understood. His training was complete. The phantom lights had taught him not just how to recognize danger, but how to help other drivers in trouble. He had become what they were, a guardian of the highway. Jake still drives the same routes, and he keeps watch for drivers who might need help. He's developed an uncanny ability to spot dangerous situations before they become critical, and he's intervened in dozens of potential accidents over the past year. Other drivers have started talking about a trucker who appears at just the right moment to offer assistance, seemingly materializing out of nowhere when help is needed most. Sometimes, late at night on empty stretches of highway, Jake sees new sets of phantom headlights in his mirrors, always 40 meters back, always watching over younger drivers who are still learning to read the road's dangers. Jake smiles when he sees them, knowing that the highway's guardian spirits have found new drivers to train, and that the tradition of invisible protection continues along America's most dangerous corridors. The headlights that once followed Jake now follow others, and somewhere out there, Jake has become the mysterious helper that other drivers will someday describe in forum posts and truck stop conversations. Another ghost story in the rich folklore of America's highways. Another guardian angel watching over those who spend their lives on the road. Rick Hoffman had been driving the same Peterbilt 379 for 8 years when it began starting itself in the middle of the night. The truck, which Rick had bought used in 2015, had always been reliable despite its age, a 2004 model with over 1 million kilometers on the odometer. But in October 2023, the big rig developed a habit that defied mechanical explanation and left Rick questioning everything he thought he knew about diesel engines. The first incident happened at a truck stop outside Amarillo, Texas. Rick had been sleeping in his cab during his mandatory rest break when the sudden roar of his engine jerked him awake at 3:17 a.m. The truck was idling smoothly, dashboard lights glowing, air conditioning running, as if someone had climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. Rick scrambled to the front of the cab, expecting to find someone trying to steal his truck. But the cab was empty. The doors were still locked from the inside, and his keys were exactly where he'd left them, on the small table beside his bunk. The engine was running perfectly, showing normal oil pressure and temperature readings, but Rick was certain he'd shut it down before going to sleep. Rick turned off the engine and tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he'd forgotten to shut it down completely. Maybe there was a problem with the ignition switch. Old trucks developed electrical quirks, and Rick had heard stories of vehicles with faulty wiring that could start themselves under the right conditions. But 3 nights later, in a rest area outside Little Rock, Arkansas, it happened again. This time, Rick was absolutely certain he'd turned off the engine. He'd even double-checked all his switches and gauges before settling in for the night. Yet at 2:43 a.m., the familiar rumble of his Caterpillar C15 engine filled the cab, waking him from deep sleep. Rick decided to have the truck checked by a mechanic at the next major truck stop. Dave Kowalski, a diesel technician with 30 years of experience, spent 2 hours examining Rick's electrical system, ignition components, and engine control module. "Everything looks normal," Dave reported. "Wiring's in good shape, ignition switch is functioning properly, and your ECM isn't showing any fault codes. There's no mechanical reason this truck should be starting on its own." Dave suggested that Rick might be experiencing a phenomenon called phantom activation, caused by electromagnetic interference from nearby cell towers or radio transmissions. It was rare, he explained, but not unheard of in older trucks with analog electrical systems. Rick wanted to believe the scientific explanation, but the self-starting incidents continued with increasing frequency. Over the next month, his truck started itself 11 times, always between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., always while Rick was sleeping. The timing was so consistent that Rick began setting his alarm for 2:25 a.m. to witness the phenomenon firsthand. The breakthrough came on a cold November night at a truck stop in Joplin, Missouri. Rick was lying awake, waiting for 2:30 a.m., when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps on the pavement outside his truck, followed by the sound of someone climbing into the cab below him. Rick quietly grabbed his flashlight and crept to the edge of his bunk. Peering down into the driver's area, he saw a figure sitting in his seat, but it wasn't quite solid. The figure appeared translucent, like a projection or hologram, wearing a flannel shirt and trucker's cap that looked decades out of date. The ghostly driver reached for the ignition with movements that seemed perfectly natural, and the engine roared to life in response to his phantom touch. The figure adjusted mirrors that didn't need adjusting, checked gauges with the practiced efficiency of an experienced trucker, then settled back in the seat as if preparing for a long haul. Rick watched in terrified fascination as the specter went through a complete pre-trip inspection routine without leaving the cab, checking air pressure, testing lights, examining instrument readings. Everything the ghost did was methodical and professional, following procedures that Rick recognized from his own training. After about 10 minutes, the phantom driver seemed satisfied with his inspection. He reached for the ignition again, turned off the engine, and climbed down from the cab. Rick heard the footsteps retreat into the distance, and then silence returned to the truck stop. Rick didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, he began asking other drivers if they'd ever experienced anything similar. Most just shook their heads or made jokes about ghost riders, but an older driver named Sam Rodriguez pulled Rick aside for a serious conversation. "You bought that truck from Johnson's Used Rigs in Dallas, didn't you?" Sam asked. "Dark blue Peterbilt with chrome stacks?" Rick nodded. Sam's expression grew somber. That was Tommy Brennan's truck. He drove it for 15 years before he passed away in 2015. Heart attack, right there in the driver's seat during a rest break. They found him the next morning, still buckled in, engine running. Tommy's family sold the truck to Johnson's after the funeral. Sam explained that Tommy had been legendary among drivers for his meticulous approach to truck maintenance and safety. He'd never had a major breakdown or serious accident in over 30 years of driving, and he attributed his perfect record to religious adherence to pre-trip inspections and maintenance schedules. Tommy used to say that his truck was his partner, not just a machine, Sam continued. He talked to it, treated it like it was alive. Some of the guys made fun of him for it, but Tommy's truck never let him down. Maybe it's still not letting him down. Rick researched Tommy Brennan's history and discovered that Sam's story was accurate. Tommy had died of a massive heart attack in October 2015 while parked at the same truck stop in Amarillo, where Rick first experienced the self-starting phenomenon. According to the police report, Tommy's engine had been running when he was found, leading investigators to conclude that the heart attack had occurred shortly after he'd started the truck for his morning departure. The more Rick learned about Tommy, the more the midnight visits made sense. Tommy had been obsessive about truck maintenance, often performing pre-trip inspections at unusual hours to avoid busy periods at truck stops. He'd been known to wake up in the middle of the night to check on his truck if he heard unusual sounds or felt something wasn't right. Rick decided to communicate with his ghostly passenger. The next time the engine started at 2:30 a.m., Rick climbed down from his bunk and sat in the passenger seat while the phantom driver performed his inspection routine. "Tommy," Rick said quietly, "is that you? Are you checking on the truck?" The translucent figure turned toward Rick, and for a moment, their eyes met. Tommy's ghost nodded slowly, then pointed at the oil pressure gauge. Rick looked and saw that the reading was slightly lower than normal, still within acceptable range, but not optimal. Over the following weeks, Rick learned to interpret Tommy's midnight inspections as an early warning system. When the ghost lingered over certain gauges or controls, Rick knew to have those systems checked by a mechanic. Tommy's phantom inspections helped Rick identify and fix problems before they became serious. A failing alternator, worn brake pads, a coolant leak that was barely visible during daylight inspections. The ghostly visits became less frightening and more comforting. Rick realized that Tommy wasn't trying to reclaim his truck. He was trying to protect it and its new driver. The midnight inspections were Tommy's way of ensuring that his beloved Peterbilt continued to operate safely and reliably. Rick started talking to Tommy during the phantom inspections, updating him on the truck's performance and thanking him for his vigilance. Sometimes Tommy would respond with subtle gestures, a nod of approval when Rick reported good maintenance, a pointing motion toward instruments that needed attention. Other drivers at truck stops began to notice Rick's unusual nighttime routine. Word spread about the Peterbilt that started itself and the driver who talked to empty air during mysterious 3 a.m. inspections. Some drivers thought Rick was losing his mind, but others who'd known Tommy Brennan understood what was happening. "Tommy was the best driver I ever knew," explained Jerry Martinez, who'd worked with Tommy for several years in the 1990s. "If his spirit is still looking after that truck, then Rick's got the safest rig on the road. Tommy never let anything slide when it came to maintenance." Rick's truck developed a reputation for unusual reliability. Despite its age and high mileage, it rarely broke down and never experienced the kind of catastrophic failures that plagued other trucks of similar vintage. Rick attributed this to Tommy's continued vigilance and began to appreciate having a ghostly co-pilot who never slept and never missed a potential problem. The relationship between Rick and Tommy evolved over time. Rick learned to recognize different types of phantom inspections, routine checks that lasted about 10 minutes, detailed examinations that could go on for half an hour when Tommy detected something concerning, and brief visits that seemed more social than mechanical. During the longer inspections, Rick would sometimes see Tommy's ghost examining parts of the truck that weren't visible from the driver's seat. Tommy would appear to walk around the entire rig, checking tire pressure, inspecting trailer connections, and examining the exhaust system. Rick learned to follow up on these extended inspections with thorough physical examinations of his truck. Rick also discovered that Tommy's presence extended beyond mechanical issues. During dangerous weather conditions, the engine would sometimes start itself as an apparent warning. Rick learned to interpret these unscheduled startups as signals to check weather reports, road conditions, or traffic alerts before continuing his route. In March 2024, Tommy's phantom inspection saved Rick's life. The ghost had been particularly agitated during his midnight visit, repeatedly pointing at the brake system gauges and making urgent gestures. Rick had the brakes checked the next morning and discovered that his brake lines were severely corroded and could have failed at any time. "Another few hundred kilometers and you'd have had no brakes at all," the mechanic told Rick. "I don't know how you knew to check this, but it probably saved your life, and who knows how many other people on the road." Rick's story spread through the trucking community, and his truck became something of a legend. Drivers would specifically look for the dark blue Peterbilt with chrome stacks, hoping to catch a glimpse of Tommy's ghost or witness the famous self-starting engine. Rick received dozens of offers to buy the truck, but he always declined. "Tommy and I are partners now," Rick would explain. "He takes the night shift, I take the day shift. It's the safest arrangement I've ever had." Rick still drives Tommy's Peterbilt, and the midnight inspections continue. The truck now has over 1.5 million kilometers on the odometer, but runs like it's brand new, thanks to Tommy's relentless monitoring and Rick's willingness to address every issue the ghost identifies. Sometimes Rick catches glimpses of Tommy during daylight hours, a translucent figure checking the truck while Rick is inside truck stops, or a ghostly hand adjusting a mirror that had shifted slightly during the drive. Rick has learned to appreciate these sightings as confirmations that he's living up to Tommy's standards of truck care and driver responsibility. The engine still starts itself at 2:30 a.m., and Rick still sits in the passenger seat during Tommy's inspections. It's become a routine that Rick wouldn't trade for anything, a partnership between the living and the dead, united by their shared love of the road and respect for the machines that carry them safely across America's highways. Marcus Thompson had been hauling freight for 12 years when he picked up the strangest shipment of his career from a warehouse in Memphis, Tennessee. The load was bound for a small town called Millfield, Kentucky, and according to the paperwork, it consisted of household goods and personal effects for someone named Elizabeth Harrison. What made the job unusual wasn't the cargo. Marcus had moved countless household shipments over the years, but the way the load seemed to have a mind of its own. The problems started before Marcus even left the warehouse. As the loading crew secured the last of the boxes and furniture in his trailer, Marcus noticed that some items kept shifting position despite being properly strapped down. An antique rocking chair that had been loaded near the front of the trailer was somehow now sitting in the middle section. Boxes marked kitchen items had rearranged themselves into a neat pyramid that hadn't been there when the loaders finished. "Weird," muttered Tony, the warehouse supervisor, as he inspected the trailer. "We've been loading trucks for 20 years, and I've never seen cargo shift like this while we were still working on it. Maybe the straps are too loose." They resecured everything with additional tie-downs and more blocking. But by the time Marcus completed his paperwork and performed his pre-trip inspection, the cargo had shifted again. The rocking chair was now positioned directly behind the cab, and several boxes had somehow moved to different sections of the trailer despite being firmly anchored. Marcus decided to proceed with the delivery, figuring that whatever was causing the shifting would settle once he got on the highway. But as he drove north through Tennessee, he could hear sounds from the trailer that shouldn't have been possible. Not the normal creaking and settling of secured cargo, but deliberate movements, as if someone was walking around back there rearranging things. Around midnight, about halfway to Kentucky, Marcus pulled into a rest area to check his load. When he opened the trailer doors, he found that the cargo had completely reorganized itself. Furniture that had been scattered throughout the trailer was now arranged as if someone had set up a living room. The rocking chair positioned near a small table, boxes labeled books stacked neatly beside a reading lamp, and a couch positioned to face what would have been a television if one had been present. Marcus stared at the arrangement for several minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. The cargo hadn't just shifted. It had been deliberately arranged with care and thought. Someone or something had unpacked items from boxes and positioned them exactly as they might appear in an actual home. "This is impossible," Marcus muttered, pulling out his phone to document the scene. As he took photos, he noticed that many of the boxes were now open, their contents neatly displayed rather than packed for shipping. A box labeled Elizabeth's China had been unpacked, with delicate plates and teacups arranged on the small table beside the rocking chair, as if someone had been about to serve tea. Marcus tried calling his dispatcher, but the phone call went straight to voicemail. He attempted to reach the Memphis warehouse, but got only an automated message saying the facility was closed. With no other options, Marcus carefully secured what he could and continued toward Kentucky, planning to sort everything out with the customer in the morning. The sounds from the trailer continued throughout the night, not random bumping and shifting, but purposeful movement. Marcus could hear what sounded like footsteps, the scraping of furniture being positioned, and occasionally what might have been humming or soft singing. The melody was faint and old-fashioned, the kind of tune his grandmother might have hummed while doing housework in the 1950s. When Marcus reached Millfield, Kentucky the next morning, he discovered that the delivery address didn't exist. The street number on his paperwork led to an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and scattered with the foundation stones of a house that had been demolished years earlier. According to a neighbor, the property had been vacant since the mid-1990s, when the last resident, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Harrison, had died, and her heirs sold the land to developers who never built anything. Marcus called his dispatcher with growing confusion and concern. "There's no house here, and the customer died almost 30 years ago. What kind of load did you guys give me?" His dispatcher, Janet Morrison, was equally puzzled. "I'm looking at the booking right now, Marcus. The customer called last week requesting immediate pickup and delivery. She specifically asked for you by name, said you'd handled moves for her family before, paid in cash. Everything seemed legitimate." Janet read Marcus the details from the booking sheet. Elizabeth Harrison had called on Tuesday afternoon, provided the Memphis warehouse address for pickup, and specified the Millfield delivery location. She'd apparently known Marcus's schedule and requested that he handle the shipment personally because of his reputation for careful handling of fragile items. "But that's impossible," Marcus said. "I've never moved anything for anyone named Harrison, and if she died in the 1990s, she couldn't have called last week." Marcus opened his trailer again to document the situation for his company's insurance purposes. What he found defied explanation even more than the previous night's rearrangement. The cargo had been completely unpacked and arranged to recreate an entire 1950s-era home. Furniture was positioned exactly as it would have been in rooms. A bedroom set, with the bed made and clothes laid out, as if someone was planning to wear them. A kitchen area, with dishes set for a meal that was never served, and a living room arranged for entertaining guests who would never arrive. Most unsettling was the attention to detail. Family photographs had been removed from their packing boxes and positioned on tables and dressers. A handwritten letter sat on the kitchen table. The ink faded, but the words still legible. "My dear family, I hope you understand why I had to come home one last time. There are things I needed to finish before I could rest." The letter was signed, Elizabeth Harrison, in an elaborate script that matched the handwriting on several other documents scattered throughout the makeshift rooms. The investigation into Elizabeth Harrison's background revealed a complicated story. She'd lived alone in Millfield for over 50 years after her husband died in the Korean War. When Elizabeth passed away in 1996, her relatives had sold most of her belongings at an estate sale, but some items had been placed in storage because the family couldn't agree on their distribution. According to county records, a storage unit containing Elizabeth's remaining possessions had been abandoned when the monthly fees weren't paid in 2015. The contents were eventually auctioned off to settle the debt, and the buyer, a dealer who specialized in vintage household goods, had reportedly sold everything to various antique shops and collectors throughout the South. Marcus realized that he might have been transporting Elizabeth's actual belongings, items that had been scattered across multiple owners and collections over the years, somehow reunited for this impossible delivery. Lisa Rodriguez had been hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest for 7 years when she encountered the weigh station that measured more than just truck weights. Located on Interstate 84 between Portland and Pendleton, Oregon, the facility appeared normal from the outside. Standard DOT signage, regulation scales, and a small office building where inspectors checked paperwork and vehicle compliance. But something about milepost 197 weigh station made experienced drivers uneasy in ways they couldn't quite explain. Lisa first noticed the anomaly during a routine eastbound run in September 2022. She was hauling lumber from a mill in Longview, Washington, to a construction site in Boise, Idaho, a route she'd driven dozens of times before. Her load was legal weight, her logbooks were current, and her truck was in good mechanical condition. It should have been a straightforward inspection. The weigh station appeared ahead exactly where it always had, but something felt different as Lisa approached. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive, and her truck's engine began running rough, despite having been serviced just 2 weeks earlier. Her CB radio, normally clear on this stretch of highway, filled with static, punctuated by what sounded like whispered conversations in languages she didn't recognize. As Lisa pulled onto the scale, the digital readout showed her gross vehicle weight as 78,400 pounds, well within legal limits for her truck and trailer combination. But underneath the weight display, another number appeared: 156,800 pounds. The second reading flickered in and out of visibility, as if the scale's computer couldn't decide whether to display it or hide it. "Something's wrong with your scale," Lisa told the inspection officer, a middle-aged man named Dave who'd checked her truck several times over the years. "It's showing 2 different weights." Dave looked at the display and frowned. The official reading showed 78,400 pounds, but Lisa was right. There was definitely a second, much higher number appearing intermittently below the first. Dave had never seen anything like it in 15 years of working at the station. "Let me have you pull forward and back onto the scale," Dave suggested. "Maybe there's a calibration issue." Lisa repositioned her truck, but the same thing happened. Her official weight remained constant at 78,400 pounds, but the phantom reading continued to flicker between 156,800 and 157,200 pounds, exactly double her actual weight, as if the scale was somehow detecting 2 identical trucks occupying the same space. Dave called his supervisor, who emerged from the office looking puzzled. The supervisor, Janet Kim, had managed the weigh station for 8 years and prided herself on maintaining equipment that met strict federal accuracy standards. The scale was calibrated last month and passed all certification tests, Janet explained as she examined the readout. "I've never seen it display dual readings like this." According to our system, everything's functioning normally, but I can see what you're talking about. While Janet and Dave discussed the technical malfunction, Lisa noticed something else unusual. Her truck's mirrors showed a perfect reflection of her rig sitting on the scale, but the reflection appeared to be sitting slightly higher than her actual truck, as if it was resting on an invisible platform or second set of scales. "Ma'am, can you step out of your cab for a moment?" Janet asked. "I want to see if the readings change when there's no one in the driver's seat." Lisa climbed down and walked over to where Janet and Dave were studying the scale display. The official weight remained the same, but the phantom reading jumped to 157,600 pounds, an increase that roughly matched Lisa's body weight. "This is impossible," Janet muttered. "The scale is somehow detecting additional mass that isn't physically present, but our calibration logs show the equipment is functioning perfectly." Janet decided to document the incident and contacted the Oregon Department of Transportation's Technical Support Division. While they waited for guidance, Lisa shared what she'd experienced during her approach to the way station: the engine problems, radio interference, and general sense of unease. "Now that you mention it," Dave said, "we've had several drivers complain about similar issues over the past few months. Radio static, engine performance problems, that sort of thing. We assumed it was interference from the new cell tower they installed about a mile east of here." Janet checked the station's incident logs and found a pattern of reports dating back to June 2022. Drivers had complained about electrical problems, navigation system malfunctions, and unexplained weight readings that didn't match their actual loads. Most concerning were reports from several drivers who claimed to have seen ghost trucks in their mirrors while crossing the scales. The ODOT technical team arrived that afternoon and spent 6 hours testing the scale equipment. Their instruments confirmed that the scales were accurately calibrated and functioning within federal specifications. The computer systems showed no software glitches or hardware malfunctions. Yet the phantom weight readings continued to appear whenever certain trucks crossed the scales. "We're seeing this secondary reading on about 30% of the vehicles that use this station," explained the lead technician, Robert Chang. "But there's no pattern we can identify. It affects different truck types, different loads, different drivers. The only consistent factor is that the phantom reading is always approximately double the actual vehicle weight." Robert's team also confirmed the dual shadow phenomenon and discovered something even more unsettling. Thermal imaging cameras showed 2 heat signatures when affected trucks crossed the scales, one matching the actual vehicle, and a second, slightly cooler signature that appeared to overlay the first. "It's as if there's a second truck present that we can detect instrumentally but can't see with the naked eye," Robert explained. "The thermal signature suggests a vehicle that's been parked for several hours, cooler than an actively driven truck, but warmer than ambient temperature." Local Native American communities provided the first clue to understanding the phenomenon. Mary Spotted Eagle, a cultural liaison from the Warm Springs Reservation, visited the way station after hearing about the incidents from tribal members who worked as truck drivers. "This area has always been significant to our people," Mary explained. "The old stories talk about it as a place where the spirits of travelers who died on the trail would gather. When someone died during a journey, their spirit would continue traveling the same route, trying to complete the trip they never finished." According to Mary, the stretch of I-84, where the way station was located, followed an ancient trading route used by native tribes for centuries. The route had seen its share of tragedy, travelers who died from illness, accidents, or harsh weather while trying to transport goods between coastal and inland communities. Lisa researched the area's accident history and found records of numerous truck-related fatalities dating back to the 1960s, when I-84 was first completed through the Columbia River Gorge. Weather-related accidents were common in the area due to sudden fog, ice storms, and high winds that could overturn loaded trucks. One accident report from 1987 particularly matched Lisa's experience. A lumber truck similar to hers had jackknifed during an ice storm just 2 kilometers east of the current way station location. The driver, Miguel Santos, had been killed instantly, but his truck had continued sliding down an embankment for several hundred meters before coming to rest. Miguel was hauling the same type of load I was, Lisa realized. Lumber from the coast to Boise, same route, same cargo, similar truck. Maybe his spirit is still trying to complete that delivery. Lisa's theory gained support when other drivers began sharing their experiences. Truckers hauling specific types of cargo, lumber, agricultural products, construction materials, were most likely to trigger the phantom readings at the way station. The ghost trucks seemed to be attracted to vehicles carrying similar loads to what they'd been transporting when they died. The way station staff developed an informal protocol for handling the anomalous readings. When phantom weights appeared, they would acknowledge them in their reports, but use only the actual vehicle weights for legal and safety purposes. Drivers were advised that the secondary readings were equipment calibration artifacts and shouldn't be cause for concern. But Lisa and other experienced drivers knew better. They understood that they were sharing the highway with the spirits of truckers who had died trying to complete their routes, still carrying their ghostly loads toward destinations they would never reach. Lisa began treating her encounters with the phantom truck as a form of professional respect. When the double weight readings appeared at milepost 197, she would quietly acknowledge Miguel Santos and other spirits who might be traveling alongside her. "Safe travels, partner," she would say to her mirrors when she spotted the second shadow or felt the presence of the unseen truck. "Hope you find your way home." Other drivers adopted similar rituals, turning the way station from a place of anxiety into a memorial for truckers who had died on the job. The Oregon Department of Transportation eventually acknowledged the pattern of anomalous readings, but classified them as unexplained instrumental phenomena rather than supernatural occurrences. Lisa still drives the Portland-Boise route regularly, and she's learned to recognize when the spirit trucks are active. On foggy days or during weather conditions, similar to those that caused historical accidents, the phantom readings are more frequent and more pronounced. The way station at milepost 197 has become an informal memorial where the living and the dead share the road as equals, united by their commitment to delivering their cargo safely to its destination. Kevin Walsh had been driving the same route between Chicago and Detroit for 9 years when he discovered Exit 127, a ramp that wasn't supposed to exist and led to places that had stopped existing decades ago. The exit appeared on Interstate 94 in southwestern Michigan, always during foggy conditions, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., and always when Kevin was running behind schedule. The first time Kevin took the mysterious exit was during a brutal November storm in 2021. He was hauling auto parts from Chicago to a Ford plant in Dearborn, and freezing rain had reduced visibility to almost nothing. His delivery was already 6 hours late, and his dispatcher was threatening to dock his pay if he missed the morning production schedule. That's when Kevin saw the green highway sign emerging from the fog. Exit 127, downtown Millbrook, gas, food, lodging. Kevin had driven this stretch of I-94 hundreds of times and had never seen an exit for Millbrook, but the promise of fuel and shelter was too tempting to ignore. The exit ramp descended steeply, and the fog thickened as Kevin descended, swirling around his cab like something from an old black and white movie. At the bottom, Kevin found himself on a two-lane road that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. Concrete pavement with expansion joints that created rhythmic thumping under his wheels. The town of Millbrook materialized like a Norman Rockwell painting. Main Street was lined with brick buildings housing businesses with hand-painted signs. Miller's Five and Dime, Sunset Diner, Home Cooking, and Murphy's Sinclair Station. Full service. Vintage cars from the 1940s and 1950s were parked along the street, their chrome bumpers gleaming. Kevin pulled into Murphy's gas station, where an attendant in coveralls and a bow tie emerged from the service bay. The young man had slicked back hair and an earnest smile that had disappeared from customer service decades ago. "Evening, sir," the attendant said, tipping his cap. "Fill her up with diesel?" "Yeah, thanks," Kevin replied. "I've never seen this exit before. Is Millbrook new?" The attendant looked confused. "New? Sir, Millbrook's been here since 1887. My grandfather pumped gas at this very station." Kevin noticed the fuel pumps were vintage models with spinning mechanical counters, but they dispensed modern diesel fuel. The price per gallon was impossibly low, 68 cents, which Kevin hadn't seen since the 1970s. Inside the station, Kevin found shelves stocked with products he hadn't seen in years. Glass bottles of Coca-Cola, candy bars in vintage packaging, motor oil in metal cans. The cash register was an ornate mechanical model, requiring the attendant to pull levers and push buttons. "That'll be $47.60, the attendant said. Kevin tried to pay with his credit card, but the attendant looked at the plastic rectangle as if he'd never seen one before. "I'm sorry, sir, but we only accept cash or company checks." Kevin paid in cash and decided to explore the town. At the Sunset Diner, he ordered coffee and pie from a waitress named Betty, who wore a pink uniform and cat-eye glasses. "You're not from around here," Betty observed. "Most of our truck drivers are regulars. Where are you headed?" "Detroit," Kevin replied. "I'm hauling auto parts for the Ford plant." Betty smiled. "Ford's doing real well these days. My husband works at the River Rouge plant. This war economy has been good for Michigan." Kevin stared at Betty. "War economy? What war?" Betty looked at him strangely. "The war in Korea, of course. Where have you been?" "My brother's stationed over there with the army." Kevin realized that somehow he'd driven into a town where it was still 1951. The Korean War, the clothing, the cars, the prices, everything pointed to a place that existed 60 years in the past. "What's today's date?" Kevin asked carefully. "November 15th, 1951, Betty replied. "Are you feeling all right, honey?" Kevin left money on the table and returned to his truck, his mind reeling. The town felt completely real, not like a historical reenactment, but like an actual community where people lived and worked in 1951. He could smell dinner cooking in houses, hear radio programs through open windows. But when Kevin tried to return to I-94, he couldn't find the on-ramp. The road that had brought him into Millbrook seemed to end at the town limits, dissolving into impenetrable fog. After 2 hours of searching, Kevin parked outside the Millbrook Motor Lodge and checked in for the night. Kevin woke up the next morning to brilliant sunshine and clear skies. But when he walked outside to check on his truck, he found himself standing in an empty field beside I-94. His truck was parked on the shoulder exactly where he'd been driving when he saw exit 127. According to his truck's clock and GPS, only 3 hours had passed since he'd left the highway. But Kevin remembered spending an entire night in Millbrook. His fuel tank was full, and his wallet contained a receipt dated November 15, 1951. Kevin researched Millbrook and discovered it had indeed existed exactly where he'd found it. Millbrook had been a thriving community from the 1880s through the 1950s, serving travelers on U.S. Highway 12, the predecessor to Interstate 94. The town had been home to about 1,200 people who worked in agriculture and services for highway travelers. But Millbrook had been abandoned in 1957 when I-94 was built through the area. The new interstate bypassed the town completely, cutting off its economic lifeline. Within 5 years, all businesses had closed and residents had moved away. The town was eventually demolished, and by 1965, nothing remained except foundation stones scattered through cornfields. Kevin found newspaper archives with photos that matched exactly what he'd seen: Murphy's Sinclair Station, the Sunset Diner, the Motor Lodge. Even Betty the waitress was there, identified in a 1952 photo as Betty Morrison, who has worked at the Sunset Diner for 3 years. Kevin began looking for exit 127 on subsequent trips, but the mysterious ramp only appeared under specific conditions. Over 2 years, Kevin found Millbrook 3 more times, always when weather was severe and he was running late. Each visit felt as real as the first. Kevin would fuel up at Murphy's Station, eat at the Sunset Diner, sometimes stay overnight at the Motor Lodge. The townspeople remembered him from previous visits, asking about his routes as if he were a regular customer. During his 3rd visit, Kevin asked Betty about the town's future. She looked confused. Future? What do you mean? Millbrook's been here for 64 years. It'll be here for 64 more, I expect. Kevin realized the people of Phantom Millbrook weren't aware they were living in the past or that their town was destined to disappear. For them, 1951 was the present, and the future was full of promise. Kevin's final visit came in March 2024, during a blizzard. This time, something was different. The town seemed less substantial, fading around the edges. Some buildings appeared translucent, and several businesses were closed with "For Sale" signs. Betty was still at the diner, but she looked older and tired. "Things have been slow lately," she told Kevin. "The state's talking about building a new highway that would bypass Millbrook completely. People are worried." Kevin realized he was witnessing Millbrook's final moments, watching the town fade as its timeline approached 1957, when I-94 opened and sealed Millbrook's fate. "It's been good knowing you, Betty," Kevin said as he prepared to leave. Betty smiled sadly. "You take care too, honey. Safe travels." Kevin has never found exit 127 again. The mysterious ramp seems to have disappeared, along with Phantom Millbrook, as if the town's spirit finally accepted its fate. But Kevin still looks for the exit during foggy nights on I-94, hoping to spend one more evening in a place where time stood still and the American dream of the 1950s continued forever.